America taxed itself and called it a trade war. The United States imposed the largest tariff increase since World War II. The stated goal was simple: punish China, rebuild manufacturing, close the trade deficit, bring the jobs home. What actually happened was something economists had predicted for decades, and politicians had ignored for just as long. The prices went up, the factories did not come back. The jobs were lost, not gained. And in early 2026, the Supreme Court ruled the entire mechanism was unconstitutional. This is not a story about China. It is a story about how the world's most powerful economy convinced itself that taxing its own consumers was the same thing as winning a trade war. And it is a story with a very specific academic name: the tariff incidence problem. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand something that most financial commentators still get wrong. Let's start with the question everyone should have been asking from day one. Who actually pays a tariff? Most people, when they hear the word tariff, picture a tax on a foreign country. The U.S. puts a 25% tariff on Chinese steel. China pays 25% more to sell into America. Simple. Except that is not how it works. That is not even close to how it works. Here is the mechanism. An American company imports steel from China. At the U.S. border, the American importer pays the tariff, not the Chinese exporter. The importer then passes that cost into their prices. Those prices travel downstream into every product that contains imported steel: cars, washing machines, construction, infrastructure. Every American business and household sitting at the end of that supply chain absorbs the cost. This is the incidence problem, and it was settled economics long before 2018. A landmark study by Amiti, Redding, and Weinstein, published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, used detailed import data to track exactly where the 2018 tariffs landed. Their finding was unambiguous. The full incidence of the tariffs fell on domestic consumers and importing firms. By the end of 2018, import tariffs were costing U.S. consumers and businesses an additional $3 billion per month in added tax costs, and another $1.4 billion per month in what economists call deadweight welfare losses. That is $4.4 billion a month, flowing out of American households and businesses. Not from Beijing. The Richmond Federal Reserve synthesized the follow-on research in 2025. Their conclusion was equally direct. The pass-through rate is generally high, often near 100%, meaning that the burden of tariffs typically falls on domestic consumers and firms rather than foreign exporters. 100% pass-through. China did not pay. America did. Now, if you have ever wondered why economists almost universally oppose tariffs while politicians almost universally love them, this is your answer. And it leads us to the most important political economy insight in this entire story. Tariffs produce visible winners and invisible losers. A steel worker in Pennsylvania kept employed because of tariff protection is a photogenic policy victory. A politician can visit that factory. They can take a photograph. They can point to a human face and say, "This is what I did." The family in Ohio paying $30 more per month on groceries and appliances has no equivalent political moment. The cost is diffused across thousands of products, invisible in any single transaction, and too small in any individual instance to generate outrage. But across 130 million American households, it is enormous. This asymmetry is not an accident. It is the design logic of protectionist policy in democratic systems. Concentrated benefits for identifiable constituencies. Dispersed costs across the entire population. Politicians exploit this gap. They always have. A cross-country study by Furcari, Hannon, Austri, and Rose, covering 151 countries over more than 50 years, confirmed the macro pattern. Tariff increases led, in the medium term, to economically significant declines in domestic output and productivity. They result in higher unemployment, higher inequality, real exchange rate appreciation, and only small effects on the actual trade balance. The trade balance. Let's sit on that for a moment. The stated goal of the entire tariff program was to reduce America's trade deficit with China. The trade deficit is the gap between what the U.S. imports and what it exports. The argument was intuitive. Tax Chinese imports, buy fewer of them, close the gap. But the trade deficit is not a scorecard of winners and losers. It is an identity. It reflects the difference between domestic investment and domestic savings. If Americans consume more than they save, which they do, the trade deficit persists regardless of tariff levels. The fundamental macroeconomic forces driving the deficit were never going to be solved by border taxes on washing machines. And the data confirmed it. The trade deficit did not close. What happened instead was a rerouting, a wholesale geographic shift in where American imports came from, not a reduction in how much America imported. Since 2017, China's share of U.S. imports has declined by over 12 percentage points. That sounds like a victory. Except those 12 points did not come back to domestic production. They migrated to Vietnam, to Taiwan, to Mexico, to the EU. Vietnam's share of U.S. imports rose by 3.7 percentage points, Taiwan by 4.1, Mexico by 2.3. This is not industrial renaissance. This is supply chain rerouting. And much of it is not even what it appears to be. Economists have a term for what happened in Vietnam specifically: tariff laundering. Much of Vietnam's export surge to the United States was not Vietnamese manufacturing. It was Chinese-owned factories, relocated across the border, producing the same products, simply stamped with a Vietnamese certificate of origin to avoid the tariff. The U.S. Commerce Department opened Section 301 investigations into Vietnam, Taiwan, Mexico, Japan, and the EU as the administration tried to close these loopholes. The whack-a-mole nature of tariff enforcement is not a policy failure. It is a structural property of the global trading system. Supply chains will always find the path of least resistance. Tariffs redirect them. They do not eliminate them. This leads us to case study 2. China. American tariffs on Chinese goods peaked at over 145% during the escalation cycle. U.S. imports from China, by June 2025, were roughly half their levels of a year earlier, falling to depths not seen since the 2009 financial crisis. China, by any conventional reading, lost the trade war. Except China's share of global trade is actually increasing. Beijing did not fight the tariffs by lowering prices to maintain U.S. market share. Instead, methodically and without urgency, it pivoted. Pro-consumption policy, stimulus was ramped up domestically. Government-led investment was redirected toward AI, new materials, and aerospace. And the export machine turned southward. Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. These are the markets where China is now deepening structural trade relationships, denominated in yuan, financed through Belt and Road infrastructure, and increasingly insulated from U.S. dollar system pressure. The Peterson Institute for International Economics summarized it concisely. China lost the U.S. market battle and appears to be winning the global trade war. This is the strategic miscalculation at the heart of the entire episode. Trade wars are not bilateral events. They are ecosystem-level disruptions. When you force a major exporter out of one market, you do not eliminate them. You accelerate their integration into every other market you do not control. Now let's come back to the United States. Because the job story is the most politically explosive part of this entire episode. The tariffs were sold, above all else, as a jobs program. Bring back American manufacturing. Reshore the factories. Rebuild the middle class. Here is what actually happened. Since President Trump's April 2025 promises to rebuild manufacturing, 59,000 factory jobs were lost, not gained. The Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index remained below 50 for much of 2025, the contractionary zone. Tariff uncertainty disincentivized companies from expanding their workforce. Manufacturers reported tariffs and tariff uncertainty as a persistent headwind in survey after survey. Laura Ulrich of Indeed Hiring Lab put it directly. It is striking how soft manufacturing has been, because in theory, you put tariffs in place to protect domestic manufacturing, so that domestic manufacturing employment grows. And we have seen the opposite of that. Why? Two reasons, and both of them were entirely predictable. First, modern manufacturing is not labor-intensive in the way the political imagination assumes. A reshored factory in 2025 is a robotics facility with a handful of highly skilled operators, not a 1970s assembly line employing 1,000 workers. Nearly 500,000 manufacturing jobs remain unfilled in the United States right now, not because the factories aren't there, but because the workers with the required digital, robotics, and AI skills do not exist in sufficient numbers. A survey of 500 U.S. manufacturers found something extraordinary. They were asked, what would bring back the most manufacturing? The top answer was not tariffs. It was not tax cuts. It was not currency devaluation. It was a stronger skilled workforce. OEMs said they would reshore 30% of offshore products if the skilled labor existed, compared to just 23% from 15% tariffs. The workforce gap is larger than the tariff gap, and no tariff regime addresses it. Second, and this is the mechanism most commentators miss, tariffs raise input costs for manufacturers who use imported materials. A steel tariff does not just protect U.S. steel producers. It raises costs for every American manufacturer that buys steel. Automakers, appliance producers, construction companies. These downstream industries employ far more people than the upstream industries being protected. This is the internal contradiction of industrial tariff policy. The same instrument that protects one sector destroys the competitiveness of 10 others. The net employment effect is negative. The academic literature is unambiguous on this point. The 2002 Bush steel tariffs are instructive here. Research found they did not improve local steel manufacturing unemployment. They actually depressed it, even years after the tariffs were removed. Now we reach the fiscal dimension. And this is where the story becomes particularly striking. The U.S. Treasury collected over $287 billion in customs duties in 2025. The Tax Policy Center estimates tariffs raised approximately $185 billion in fiscal year 2026 alone. On paper, this looks like revenue. Politicians pointed to it as proof the tariffs were working. But there is a critical question that almost nobody was asking. Where did that revenue go? The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas produced a research paper on exactly this question. Their finding was sobering. The ultimate effect of a tariff on U.S. consumers depends critically on how tariff revenue is used. If redistributed efficiently, returned to households as a dividend or tax rebate, revenues can offset the inflationary impact. However, if revenues are not returned to households, real income losses from higher post-tariff import prices outweigh any potential gains. The revenue went to the Treasury. It was not returned to households. The mechanism was broken by design. U.S. households paid over $1,000 more for the same goods over the past year alone. The average U.S. effective tariff rate rose from 2.6% to over 13%, the highest level since World War II. The Tax Foundation estimated the tariffs amount to an average tax increase per U.S. household of $1,500 in 2026. Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, stated publicly that tariffs were responsible for the entirety of inflation's rise above the 2% target in 2025. Think about that. The Federal Reserve's own chair attributed the entirety of above-target inflation to tariff policy. Not to supply chains, not to energy, not to labor markets, to tariffs. This is not a heterodox fringe position. This is the Fed. The share of businesses passing on more than half of tariff costs to consumers rose to 34% by February 2026, up from just 13% in May 2025, and 55% of executives surveyed plan to raise prices by up to 15% in the next 6 months. Brian Higgins of KPMG described it precisely. The burden of tariffs has now moved squarely onto the consumer. While businesses absorb the initial shock to their margins, the overwhelming majority are now reshaping their pricing models for a trade environment where cost pressures are the new constant. Now I want to give you the PhD layer. Because there is a theoretical framework here that explains not just why the tariffs failed, but why they were structurally destined to fail beyond a certain threshold. It is called the tariff Laffer curve. You may be familiar with the original Laffer curve from tax policy, the idea that there is a nonlinear relationship between tax rates and total tax revenue. At 0, you collect nothing. At 100%, you collect nothing, because nobody produces. Somewhere in between is the revenue maximizing rate. The same nonlinear logic applies to tariffs, but the welfare implications are even more severe. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas modeled this relationship explicitly. At low tariff rates, revenue generation can offset the inflationary impact on real incomes. Households pay more for imported goods, but if tariff revenues are redistributed, the net effect on disposable income can be neutral or mildly positive. This is the window in which tariffs are economically defensible. But as tariff rates rise further, the positive fiscal effects taper off while the negative impact on real factor incomes intensifies. There is a critical threshold. Beyond it, further tariff increases reduce real disposable income and private consumption, even if tariff revenue continues to grow in absolute terms. The welfare loss from higher prices outpaces the fiscal dividend. The United States crossed that threshold in 2020. This is not hindsight analysis. The research predicted it. Michael Feroli, J.P. Morgan's chief U.S. economist, warned that the trade policy drag made a recession more likely than not at peak tariff levels. And here is the deepest paradox of all. When researchers examine tariff incidence through the lens of traditional trade theory, complete pass-through leads to a puzzling conclusion about government rationality. If the full cost falls on domestic consumers, if there are no terms of trade welfare effects for the imposing country, then the welfare-maximizing tariff rate is actually 0. The tariff war constitutes what the academic literature calls an economic paradox, self-inflicted welfare losses for every participant. Every country loses. The initiating country loses most. The workers the tariffs were sold to protect lose too. And yet, as we noted earlier, the political incentive structure that produces tariffs is entirely rational from the perspective of the politician. This is not a failure of information. It is a failure of institutional design. Then came April 2026, and the Supreme Court. The administration had imposed the tariffs using authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, EPPA. The legal argument was that trade deficits constituted a national emergency, giving the executive branch unilateral authority to impose tariffs without congressional approval. The Supreme Court did not agree. The ruling struck down EPA-based tariffs as an unconstitutional overreach of executive authority, a delegation of congressional power that the legislature had never actually granted. Trade policy, under the Constitution, is a congressional function. Even after the ruling, the remaining tariff rate, the floor of what survived, stood at 9.1%. The Yale Budget Lab noted that is still the highest U.S. tariff rate since 1946, excluding 2025. And now there is a fiscal consequence that has not yet fully registered in the public discourse. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates the U.S. government may be required to refund as much as $175 billion to businesses that paid EPA-based tariffs. That is $175 billion of collected revenue that was already spent, now potentially owed back. The tariff program was not just economically unsustainable. It was constitutionally unsustainable. The mechanism collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Let us now crystallize the 5 insights that this entire episode has generated. Insight 1. Tariffs are domestic taxes. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal accounting identity. When the U.S. places a tariff on an imported good, an American entity pays it at the border. There is no economic mechanism through which a foreign country absorbs that cost without deliberately choosing to do so, and China did not choose to. The full incidence landed on American firms and households. Insight 2. Trade deficits are not a manufacturing problem. They are a savings problem. The U.S. trade deficit persists because Americans invest more than they save. No tariff regime addresses that fundamental imbalance. Tariffs redirect trade flows. They do not change the underlying savings and investment identity. The deficit before, the deficit after. Essentially unchanged. Insight 3. Reshoring requires workforce development, not tariffs. The survey data is unambiguous. American manufacturers would reshore more production for access to a skilled workforce than they would for a 15% tariff. The bottleneck is human capital, digital skills, robotics, advanced manufacturing training, not the cost of Chinese imports. Tariffs solve the wrong problem. Insight 4. Trade wars are ecosystem disruptions, not bilateral contests. The U.S. treated the trade war as a U.S.-China negotiation. China treated it as a strategic inflection point to diversify away from U.S. market dependence entirely. China is now more integrated into emerging market economies than at any point in its history. The trade war accelerated China's decoupling from the U.S.-centric trading system, precisely the outcome the U.S. was trying to prevent. Insight 5. The tariff Laffer curve is real. There is a threshold beyond which tariff increases produce negative welfare outcomes even for the country imposing them. The U.S. crossed that threshold. The Federal Reserve said so. The Supreme Court said so. The employment data said so. The only entities that did not say so were the ones who had designed the policy in the first place. What happens next? The Supreme Court ruling creates a significant legal and political reset. Congress would need to pass legislation to reimpose tariffs at the levels the executive branch had unilaterally set, and that faces considerable resistance from business lobbies, agricultural exporters, and import-dependent industries that bore the costs. The 9.1% floor that survived the ruling still represents a meaningful trade barrier and a meaningful tax on American consumers and businesses. The manufacturing workforce gap will persist regardless of tariff policy. By 2033, the U.S. manufacturing sector may need 3.8 million new workers, with nearly 1.9 million of those roles at risk of going unfilled if workforce development investment does not scale dramatically. China will continue its strategic pivot. The Belt and Road Initiative, yuan-denominated trade agreements, and deepening supply chain integration with Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America are structural, not reactive. They will not reverse when tariffs change. The global trading system itself faces a fundamental stress test. The multilateral rules-based order, built around the WTO, the dollar, and the assumption of U.S. commitment to open trade, has been materially weakened, not just by one administration's tariff policy, but by the bipartisan consensus that has emerged around economic nationalism. The question is not whether tariffs will remain part of U.S. trade policy. They will. The question is whether the next iteration will be designed with awareness of the tariff Laffer curve, with pass-through mechanisms to households, workforce investment funded by tariff revenue, and sector-specific application targeted at genuine national security concerns, rather than broad macroeconomic objectives that tariffs cannot achieve. The lesson from 2018 to 2026 is not that tariffs are never appropriate. Selective, well-designed, institutionally grounded tariff policy has a legitimate role in trade strategy. The lesson is that tariffs used as macroeconomic instruments to close trade deficits, create broad employment, or coerce trading partners into structural concessions do not work. They never have. And the academic literature has been saying so for decades. The tariff trap is not a trap sprung by China. It is a trap built into the instrument itself. Here is the one sentence I want you to take from this video. A tariff is not a weapon pointed outward. It is a tax pointed inward, and every dollar of it lands on the economy that fired it. If this analysis changed how you think about trade policy, share it with one person who still believes China pays the tariffs. That conversation is worth having. And if you want to go deeper on the international financial mechanisms behind dollar dominance, currency manipulation, and how the global reserve system shapes everything we discussed today, that video is next.